Welcome to Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of informal conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. In these conversations, we are speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I'm Ntina Tzouvala. I work at UNSW at the Faculty of Law and Justice. And today I'm joined by Professor Zohra Ahmed, who is an associate professor at the Boston University School of Law, and by Dr. Nasia Hadjigeorgiou, who is an associate professor at the University of Central Lancashire in Cyprus. Zohra writes and teaches about the US carceral state and US militarism, and she examines how law and political economy shape the distribution of state violence, as well as she also studies the social movements that have risen up to challenge criminalization and militarization. Nasia works on matters of transitional justice and human rights, but she has also written extensively on questions of military bases, especially in Cyprus, and international law, including her 2022 piece, Decolonizing Cyprus 60 Years After Independence, an assessment of the legality of the sovereign base areas. And as you might have picked up already, Nasia and Zohra are here to talk about military bases, empire, and international law. But before we get into this strangely topical issue, it's our traditional first question. Zohra and Nasia, what is your drink of choice? We are recording at very disparate time zones, so I suspect the drinks will vary accordingly.
I think I'll go for tea at this time of day here. Tea is probably the best.
Yeah, for me, it's hot water and lemon. I feel like an old lady, but that's where we're at.
Yeah, and it's also very late, early, where Zohra is at. And I'm actually just having plain water because where I am is late. And if I drink anything relaxing or anything alcoholic, I'll just fall asleep. Okay, so the reason we are talking about military bases and international law today, beyond the fact that it is interesting, is the fact that it is closely related to the unfolding war in the Middle East. On the 28th of February 2026, Israel and the US launched an armed attack against Iran. This attack was, of course, a long time coming, and it has since triggered a broader war that has engulfed the Middle East in its entirety. For example, the US-based human rights activist news agency estimates that over 1,300 Iranian civilians have been killed today, including notoriously 150 girls whose school was targeted in the first few days of the hostilities. In response, Iran and its allies in the region have launched attacks, especially drone attacks, against both US and UK military bases across the Middle East. As a response, on the 11th of March 2026, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution that condemned, out of everyone involved, Iran's attacks against Gulf states as being internationally unlawful and as constituting, and I'm quoting here, a serious threat to the international peace and security. Nasia and Zohra have both written about, as I've said before, about military bases in international law. And today we are meant to talk both about doctrinal issues concerning them, but also I would say more broadly, what can we learn through these military bases about international law, decolonization, and sovereignty? But before we proceed any further, I was wondering if either of you or both of you can give our listeners a little bit of a sense of how did the US, and to a lesser extent, but to a significant extent, the UK as well, ended up with all these military bases across the Gulf states, across Cyprus, etc., but also I would say across the world as a whole. How did we get there?
So I think the two countries ended up with military bases through two rather different processes. If I start with the UK, which, as you said, has far fewer military bases than the US, it basically redeveloped some of its colonies into military bases. So that's the case with the Chagos Archipelago. So that's Bayot, the British Indian Ocean Territory, which is one of the main bases often used in the Middle East. It used to be part of Mauritius, which was a British colony. And then the British separated Chagos from Mauritius, gave independence to Mauritius, and left Chagos as a colony, which they then converted into a military base. The same also applies to the military bases they have in Cyprus, which are their biggest military bases in the Middle East. The Cyprus as a whole, the island as a whole, used to be a colony of the British. Then 97% of the island was decolonized, and the other 3% of the island remained a British colony, and that is what it is still today. And these are two bases, Akrotiri and Egeia, that are military bases and at the same time colonies of the UK. So that's the UK history of bases. In the US, I think, has a slightly different way of coming about, of basically obtaining bases, and they do that through SOFAs, so status of forces agreements. They sign agreements between the US and the country in which the military base is found. And in these agreements, there are provisions as to the obligations of the US, the rights of the US, and the obligations of the state in which the base is. And there is a sort of lease-like arrangement, which is different to what the UK does, where because the bases are colonies, they are considered sovereign territories of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Nasia. That's actually really helpful, especially because I think it makes clear that because of the different political and legal histories, whether the power was or wasn't a formal colonial power has led to very different legal arrangements in the present, right? Zohra, do you have anything to add either about the law, about the politics and history of how we've ended up with a world full of US military bases?
I mean, I'll just add, not from a legal perspective, but more just from sort of the long history perspective, which is that these military bases have had many lives and have been used for many different purposes, given the conflicts and the configurations of the US in a particular region. So Guantanamo, for example, has served many different purposes over time. A refugee depot, obviously the really horrific, notorious site for extraordinary rendition and forever detentions, and then also potentially again, it's been back in the news since Trump took power as a refuge, as a site for resettlement and potentially migrant detention. And so these are sort of places where the U.S. has been able to maintain a foothold for whatever it needs it might have regionally. And so these are also dynamic spaces, and how far and how the U.S. can use it in part depends on the will of the state leasing the territory and the activities that the United States is it wants to carry out. And so, for example, in a country like Djibouti, you see actually some tension between the US and the government of Djibouti about what exactly the US can use the Djibouti air base for. And those questions, I think, are obviously ones that we'll elaborate further. But just to say that these are flexible spaces that are both used to kill, to station, and to detain. And those purposes can change over time depending on the needs.
Thanks. That's actually extremely illuminating. So I'll get us back for a moment to more doctrinal issues, because Nasia, you have written about the importance of the ICJ's Chagos Archipelago advisory opinion as a potential basis for the first category of states that you mentioned, so like former colonies, for post-colonial states, to challenge the lawfulness of agreements, especially of agreements that condition their independence on the former colonial power, especially the UK, maintaining sovereign bases on their territory. And you have talked about the advisory opinion as a potentially radical and far-reaching, especially in concern as far as Cyprus is concerned. Can you explain a little bit, like, what was the specific legal test that the ICJ adopted about what and when the lawfulness of this agreement is dubious, and how it could be relevant beyond Mauritius, in your case, of course, Cyprus?
So basically, the court came up with I think it's a three-stage test, I think you can say. The first part of the test was merely a statement that the right to territorial integrity of a colony, so of a non-self-governing territory, is a corollary to the right to self-determination. Then it proceeded to say that the detachment of part of a colony before independence is in violation of the right to self-determination, unless, and this is the crucial bit, unless the decision is based on the free and genuine will of the people of the colony. So as I mentioned before, what the UK did on at least a couple of occasions was to have a far bigger territory, and then it carved out the bit that it considered necessary for its military operations and kept that as a mini colony while giving independence to the rest of the territory. Now, the court said that in order for this carving out to be legal, it needs to take place with the free and genuine will of the people having been secured. And then the last part of the test was to stress that whether the free and genuine will of the people has been exercised in cases of decolonization needs to be subjected to heightened scrutiny. So you cannot just assume that just because there is an agreement in place, that agreement necessarily reflects the free and genuine will of the people. You need to dig a bit further. And that's what the court did in Chagos, and it reached the conclusion that the Mauritians did not really consent because they were basically told, and I'm paraphrasing here, they were basically told either separate Chagos and get independence for the rest of the colony, or don't get independence at all. And that is what happened in Cyprus as well. And that is why I argue that that is evidence that the free and genuine will of the Cypriots was not respected, and therefore there is a case to be made for the illegality of the sovereign base areas in Cyprus.
Right, absolutely. And one of the points that you make that is really interesting is that because these were not agreements between sovereign states, right? They were agreements between political leaders of self-determination movements and the colonial power. We are outside the traditional Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties grounds for voiding a treaty, right? Because normally the argument here would be, well, if force was not used, the imbalance of power is not enough to invalidate consent, right? Do I understand your argument correctly?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So, but in this case, the court said that the imbalance between the colonizer and the colony is such that it's not that necessarily the imbalance results in a lack of agreement, but the imbalance makes it necessary to properly scrutinize whether there is an agreement rather than take it for granted that the signing of a document itself is reflecting of consent.
Yes. So, and I think that's really interesting, right? Because in many ways, the Vienna Convention is such an unfriendly document when it comes to scrutinizing the consent of the weaker party, right? But because this is not technically a treaty for the purpose of the Vienna Convention, the court was able, in a sense, to step outside the Vienna Convention doctrine while not challenging it directly, right? Not directly saying, we think there is something wrong with this. It's just indirectly it becomes clear these are not, and they don't spell out these things. But as you say in your article, that's the only logical legal construction, right? That we are talking about agreements where different rules appear to apply, and suddenly we are able to care about, let's say, non-forcible coercion, right? Or something like that.
Yes, precisely. precisely that. And just one last point. I thought that the ICJ advisory opinion was so radical. It could have very easily said there is an agreement, the agreement is good enough, there's no need to dig further. Could have done that, and people would have even considered that a normal response from the ICJ, right? It would have been in line with the Vienna Convention, and that would have been okay. The fact that it went out of its way to come up with a different reading of what happened, I think is impressive.
Yeah, and the fact that it gave the law of decolonization, let's say, such a central position to its reasoning, which of course was also prompted by the way the question was framed, right? Because the question was framed, just for the benefit of the listeners, if the process of decolonization was lawfully concluded, right? So this immediately framed the debate in a way that brought the relevant, for example, UN General Assembly resolutions to the center much more than the Vienna Convention.
Yes, correct.
So that takes us to our next point, right? Which is, as you also explained, Nasia, earlier, this reasoning was rooted in the particular relationship between a formal, colonial power and a formal colony, right? And does not, I think, obviously extend to states that have consented to such military bases after they became independent. And one of the reasons that I did really want Zohra to be part of this conversation is because you have written specifically of how US militarism basically secures the consent of post-colonial states' government through a mixture of basically client-patron relationships, but also forms of economic coercion or economic compulsion, right? And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this relationship and also how international law came to be basically largely agnostic about the second type of military bases.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just start with a story, which is in 2010, Pakistan experienced some of the most devastating floods in its history. And, a significant portion of the country, including agricultural land, was underwater. And we've seen floods since then that may be in recent memory, that have similarly devastated so much of the country. One of the things that the country and managers do in the midst of the floods is figure out how to redirect the water. And in that question of how do we which villages do we save? How do we kind of try to redirect the water? There's a question of what to do with the US military base outside of Jacobabad in Pakistan. And through a series of negotiations between Pakistani leaders and US military leaders, the decision was to save the base and to flood the nearby village. And that is, in fact, what happened. And so that kind of negotiation and the result of the negotiation tells you a lot about what are the costs of military buildup within countries like Pakistan that have positioned themselves over long periods of time as very willing client states, and who loses from that military buildup and whose desires and whose livelihood is really preserved. So this is a story that my friend Madiha Tahir, who's a academic and who's doing work on Pakistan, tells in her book. But I think I just wanted to start with kind of what are the terms of consent and who wins from these agreements and who loses. So the longer history of military bases, at least in the context of the war on terror from 2004 to 2018, one of the key actors in the US war on terror was really during that period of time was Pakistan, because it played a really critical role in both providing a base for strikes in Afghanistan, but also the way that goods were sort of transported to Afghanistan. Pakistan was the land route for that. So it played a very important logistical and military role for the US to be able to conduct activities in a neighboring country. And the question is, why did Pakistan say yes to this? Because the US and US attack on the Taliban was hugely unpopular, and there's sort of a baseline sentiment of anti-Americanism within sort of on the streets of Pakistan. And so if you look closer as to like why this happened, there's a deeper history, and that is really of Pakistan's acute dependency on foreign resources. And Pakistan is a country that has again and again been on the precipice of balance of payments crisis, and it is one of the most prolonged users of IMF resources. And of course, we know that the IMF is controlled in a large part by the US because it has almost 16% of the votes on the board, and the US can veto any assistance package it wants because of that controlling share. And you have extraordinary incidents where someone like General Petraeus, who's the head of U.S. Central Command, going to the IMF to lobby on Pakistan's behalf. And doing so because it needs Pakistan not to go through an economic crisis, and it needs to and he needs to show that the U.S. will reward Pakistan's excellent cooperation during the war on terror. So at first, the assistance, the aid really looks like carrots. And I think that's certainly part of the story that will reward you. But also the carrots become so delicious, so addictive that they actually become sticks. And if you look sort of deeper at the kind of the reason why Pakistan needs this foreign credit, there's a story of foreign dependency, which is a legacy of decolonization, and also a domestic class structure that has become so dependent on foreign credit to be able to avoid taxation and redistribution and other modes of revenue distribution, other modes of revenue mobilization. So consent to military bases, consent to military logistics, consent to cooperation more broadly is done under conditions of compulsion that are cultivated by certain domestic actors because it suits them at the expense of the majority, and that in large part, international law is, as you say, Dina, agnostic, indifferent to the reasons why countries say yes or no, is indifferent to who benefits and who loses. And so there obviously is a provision within the Vienna Convention that you could vitiate agreement if it's patently unlawful. And so there are potentially arguments that you could make that there are legislative enactments in Pakistan that have said at various moments that that Pakistan cannot say yes to military strikes unless the legislature, domestic legislator approves it. And so it's possible to take note of the domestic law, and there's arguments by special rapporteurs that ought to be the direction that international law should take. But I think those kinds of arguments are really important, but it also ignores the real material reasons that that it's in the state's interest to say yes if it wants to avoid default, right? And so one of the reasons why the Pakistani military can sideline democratic actors is because it can say, yes, I know that this is, unpopular, but if we say yes, we can guarantee that the purse strings remain open. And this is towards everyone's benefit. And only the military can do so because the reason why Pakistan is even relevant to US actors and lenders is because of its promise that it can deliver geopolitical security in the short term by means of facilitating US military operations. So that's certainly the story of Pakistan from 2004, 2018. And now you see this again with Pakistan being on the board of peace, which is hugely unpopular, right? A country that for the majority of whom solidarity with Palestine is sort of an unquestionable kind of part of being Pakistani. And the reason is in part is the promise of assistance by all the various actors who are part of the board of peace, and Trump in particular.
Thank you. That's actually really, really, and I think the example of Pakistan is really illustrating of, basically both the agnosticism of international law towards coercion or economic pressure, but also the agnosticism of international law towards, or the state centrism of international law, right? And its agnosticism towards domestic relations of power that can make consent possible in contexts where the thing consented on it's extremely unpopular or even um, long or even short-term detrimental to the interests of the vast majority. Nasia, do you have anything?
Yes. So while Zora was talking, I found the discussion fascinating, by the way. I have to admit I know a lot less about military bases in Pakistan than I should. But I couldn't I couldn't stop myself from making the comparison. So Pakistan seems to me to have a say, at least a very small say, but at least it has a say as to what the US is doing in its military bases. There seems to be an expectation, and Zora, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the US needs to inform Pakistan at the very least about how the military bases are being used. That is decisively not the case with British military bases. So Cyprus and Mauritius do not know what is happening in British military bases, and there is zero expectation that they will be asked as to whether the actions of the UK in the bases are in line with the Cypriot national interests or in line with popular expectations. So to go back to Gaza, the British are using the SBAs in Cyprus to provide intel to the Israelis. That is unpopular among Cypriots, but there is no way of stopping them. The SBAs are British territory. They are not guests in Cyprus in the way that the Americans are guests in Pakistan.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because I think like it can help us walk this very fine line between saying there is fundamental similarities here and the decolonization versus process versus independent state in some ways doesn't matter because of what Zora talked about economic dependencies. But I think at the same time, Nasia, there is a point to be made, which is on certain registers, it does matter, right? Whether there is a state that can even articulate this patron-client relations is different. Like it can make a difference. Whether the difference is huge, I think it's on the case-by-case basis, but I do think we can see that having the advantage of like basically national sovereignty plus lease can give some leverage to the territorial state that in cases that, as you say, the former colonial power maintains sovereignty, this leverage just simply is not there.
And if I can add something, I think this is the reason why President Trump, when he backed down of his Greenland expansionist adventure, he was persuaded that maybe what the US needed were military bases in Greenland. And you might think, okay, but the US already has 14 bases in Greenland. What it has are US style bases in Greenland. So leases. What he was promised are UK style bases in Greenland, so sovereignty. The idea is that if the US is to acquire another military base in Greenland, which is the promise that de-escalated the whole crisis, this base would be modeled on the British bases in Cyprus.
That's actually extremely interesting. I didn't know that. And it's also interesting because it paves the way for the next question I wanted to ask you, right? Which is, oh, Zora, I think before I ask any questions, Zora.
I know. I just wanted to remark on the question of like permission and advance notice with regards to using the base, because obviously one critical way that the bases have been used in Pakistan and the territory of Pakistan has been used is just the U.S. has launched drone strikes within the territory, and so you can sort of tell the story of those permissions actually narrates a geopolitical story rather than a legal story. So at the beginning, there's reporting that the US would send a fax to Pakistan's security agency saying we're going to launch a drone strike. But as the drone strikes grew more and more unpopular and there was more protest about it, Pakistan, every time a drone strike would launch on its US drone strike would launch on its territory and kill people, Pakistan's foreign ministry would issue a statement saying, we disapprove, we condemn, this is bad. And so there was an obvious tension between the sort of acquiescence and this public disapproval. As the public condemnations grew louder and louder, the US stopped sending advance notice to Pakistan. And so you're right that the fact of the facts of the advance notice is noteworthy, but also the strikes continued, notwithstanding formal renunciation and condemnation. So, I think, and then over time, those formal renunciations and became to some extent costly enough for the United States that it stopped using Pakistan as heavily. And I think that may be reevaluated. But yeah, the public resistance to it has meant that the US's operations had to be slowed down and eventually sunsetted out, although it did overlap with the end of its own interest in Afghanistan, so hard to sort of disentangle the two. But yeah, I think the point of permissions relates to sovereignty, but it's not that sovereignty is just one of many factors in the US's decision making.
Of course. No, that makes a lot of sense, right? I think we are threading a very fine line here about like between saying sovereignty matters, but not nearly as much as like the textbook version of sovereignty would tell you it matters, right? It matters in the sense of like sometimes it just matters as a mechanism of enriching whatever the local political class that gives consent is, right? It matters. It matters a lot in the sense that creates rents for them, but that's not exactly like what like sovereignty was promised to be during decolonization, for sure. On that note, I think I'll take us to the question I was about to when Nasia mentioned Greenland, right? Which is, for those who have read it, historian Daniel Immerwahr has this incredible book called How to Hide an Empire. And he has argued that as far as the US at least was concerned, military bases replaced territorial empires after World War II. In his telling, the improvement of logistics during World War II and also the invention of synthetic rubber made the maintenance of a large territorial empire largely unnecessary and too costly, literally and politically, from a US point of view, right? Rather, the US, Immerwahr says, opted for what he calls a pointillist empire, right? Little dots around the world, the existence of which was actually compatible with formal decolonization. And that takes me to Nasia's point, right? That the US under the current administration has started making noises about a desire to expand territorially, be it in Canada or in Greenland. But also we see, I think for the first time in over a century, right? Members of a US administration, be it Miller or Rubio, openly denouncing formal decolonization, right, as an attack against Western civilization. Whatever the US actually did, which very often was to slow down national liberation movements, at least rhetorically, it was friendly to decolonization, right? So I think that is a huge break in US foreign policy of like 80, or at least rhetoric, like at least 80 years. Anyhow, that's a very long way of asking a question, which is, in light of the above, do you see the relationship of the US to territorial empire shifting? I think Nasia implied that that is probably true. And if so, what would be the consequences for international law as we know it? Like, what would it mean if the main hegemonic power decides that it wants either territorial, like sovereign bases, or UK style, as Nasia said, or they just want full-on territorial expansion. Nasia?
Um, so as I said, that I think that Trump really liked the idea of having a bit of US territory somewhere else. I'm not sure whether that signals a change in US policy or whether that signals Trump's ambition. Um, I, I don't know. But from what Zohra was saying, sovereignty does play even a small part. So ultimately, Pakistan's resistance to the use of its bases in a particular way stopped the US from using it, from using the bases. So I think it would be very convenient for the US to have sovereign bases around the world. And if the expansionist policy and aggressive policy that we're seeing from the US today is to continue, that might mean that the existence of or the type of military bases that exist need to be reconsidered. Don't know whether that made sense.
It does. No, it does, right? Like, in a sense, you're saying that you see perhaps a tendency of the US or a potential for the US to move away from the lease toward a claimed territorial sovereignty, right? Do I get that right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or yes, you understand that, right? Because this seems to be in line with its foreign policy generally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Zohra?
Yeah, I think, Nasia, the kind of distinction you've introduced is so rich between the sovereign and the non-sovereign military bases. And I think that's something that's incredibly just really helps nuance kind of what is the footprint that is most desirable for the kind of goals that the US wants to pursue. Um, I think a few things about territorial expansion. I saw that this morning the Israel has announced that it's going to start a limited ground invasion of southern Lebanon. And that news to me is important in that it signals that to the extent that we're seeing, obviously, a move away from multilateralism and a move towards sort of regionalism, right? If we think of the John Rowe Doctrine as an embrace of the U.S. having its little fiefdom, and with the U.S. support for Israel's war on Iran and now of Lebanon. That's another kind of regional enclosure that the US is granting to Israel to sort of reorganize in its image. And so I think the question of territorial expansion that the US might be supporting is also of just the regional power players that it is anointed as being able to be free to do what they want in their backyards. And I think that that might be one of the ways that territorial expansion and might be that might be the US's relationship to territorial expansion, or the easier way that the US has, the easier mode of endorsing territorial expansion. Because obviously within the United States, the question of boots on the ground becomes the limit for US military adventures, right? And so whether the US will put boots on the ground is the big talking point. It's the only way that really will gas prices and boots on the ground are the kind of two political limits imposed on US imperialism domestically. And so then the question is, does the US have enough air power to pursue its agenda, or does it, and what wins, right? Is it the Trump and Rubio's sort of desire for a new world order? Can that does that win out over the isolation? So I think in part the question, it remains to be seen, I think, how far the US will go, because I think it depends in part on how the negotiations occur within the MAGA coalition, and also the extent, the sort of the real limits on US air power, which I think it seems like, Trump has sort of made statements that, Biden depleted our air power. Now I've replenished it. And then, other reporting suggests that, actually the US is hitting some limits, and Iran has been able to sort of diminish some of its air capacities. But my sense about kind of, the the real threat of the territorial expansion is really just allowing other actors to do it with US permission.
That makes a lot of sense. And to take us full circle to Nasia's earlier points about Chagos, I don't see how any version of either what Nasia said or what Zohra said is compatible in any way with the post-1960s version of international law, right? Like it would like as in a law that allowed at least some form of or not just allowed, mandated some form of formal decolonization and talked in terms of like territorial integrity and self-determination and political independence, right? It seems to me whether we are talking about the more constrained version of turning leases into colonies or the let's create some sort of like gross realm for each power and its clients, they seem to not be compatible even with the very superficial form of sovereignty that Zohra was talking about, right? Like the sort of Pakistani, let's consent to strike so that we can get money, like from the IMF sort of thing. Like to me, this seems to be because it's one thing to say, Nasia, and I agree with you that like, the UK got away with it in 1960. But as you say also in your piece, the tricky thing with 1960 is that it was just before this international law of decolonization started getting crystallized, right? To get away with it in 2026 would require, in my view, like the undoing of all this international law of decolonization of the 60s and 70s. Like, is that how you guys see things, or am I being dramatic about it?
I think that the UK just about managed to get away with it in 1960, and they knew that they couldn't get away with it even as early as 1965. And that is why they separated Chagos from the rest of Mauritius in 1965, and they gave independence to Mauritius in 1968. So they left a gap of 3 years between the two actions. While in Cyprus, the separation of the bases from the rest of the island and the independence of the Republic of Cyprus happened in the same document. So, right, the Treaty of Establishment that establishes the bases also establishes the independent Republic of Cyprus. I think that the British realized that that was a problem. And they realized it as early as 1965. So to be talking about possible colonization today is unthinkable. I mean, well, it's not unthinkable. We're talking about it, but it would have been unthinkable 2 years ago.
Yeah. Zohra?
I don't think you're being dramatic. I mean, I think what we're seeing is, and yet also we know there's so much continuity. We're seeing the marginal um, kind of, or conduct that was treated as marginal become, acceptable, or the dirty secrets becoming just a mode of praxis. So just, all of the agreements that the US has struck with countries for third country deportations, for tariffs. I mean, those agreements are incredible. Or you could argue, okay, it's just hard bargaining, or you could say it's economic coercion. And the fact that international law doesn't have a particularly good answer for distinguishing between the two, and it tolerates a lot of what we would call economic coercion as just hard bargaining. I think that that is one of the vulnerabilities and ambiguities that the Trump administration is exploiting. But I think there's also just like obviously a very clear like vibe change and one of the vibe changes is it's just not even a pretense of consent, not a pretense of let's get along, let's work it out. There's, I think, as Azla Bali has mentioned, just an explicit embrace of the punching down as a method of governing the world order, which I think is obviously a vibe shift from an international legal order that at least talked about itself based on consent and cooperation, and certainly the efforts by formerly colonized states to emphasize cooperation. That ethos is obviously is completely abandoned, and even those that might have once paid lip service to it as well have or have a permission to abandon it.
On that happy note, I'll bring the festivities to an end. And we're going to drop under the pod Nasia's article, Zohra's article, as well as a few other resources for those who are interested in learning more about military bases, international law, and US-UK empire. Thank you all for listening.